Okay, this is grade 10 again. Now we're on, this is Friday, and we're dealing with our new topic, which you should have received the handout by Google Classroom, all about the debate regarding free trade and protectionism. It's probably the #1 debate that I can think of in the macro syllabus. It's a topic that is a burning issue these days, partly because of the American policy now in regard to China, and particularly about Donald Trump, that he is very pro-protectionism, which sounds really good in that it sounds like Donald Trump is concerned about what he views as the unfair competition provided by China in regard to almost all products that China is producing. I think I mentioned before, you can go to Walmart in the United States and you can buy a table and a chair for $1 each, and that is so unreasonably low that clearly the Americans and many other Western countries feel that China is doing something a bit tricky, and that they feel that there is a form of what they call dumping going on, and where the Chinese are selling products at below their cost of production. And you would immediately say, well, how is that possible? Nobody produces anything for a price lower than the cost of production. But there are many reasons. It could be a long-term strategy where you could argue that China is trying to destroy the furniture industry in United States so that they could eventually raise their prices and make a lot of profit. It could be that the Chinese are looking for US dollars or hard currency, and therefore they would prefer to sell their products at a lower price to the US more than, let's say, to Zimbabwe, maybe at a higher price, but that China doesn't really want to receive Zimbabwe dollars in payment. Something like that. Now, of course, the Chinese will respond and say, no, this is just a reflection of how efficient we are, and that it's really unfair for us to be isolated and to be criticized, and that you Westerners need to get your act together and you need to start becoming more efficient. And so that is the argument being used. That's the debate. And the World Trade Organization is the main organization which exists in order to essentially to promote free trade, but also to be almost like a jury and a courtroom whenever there are conflicts or debates between two countries as to whether this selling bananas, for example, to certain countries at cheaper prices, is fair or unfair. A really good example was the British, who were buying bananas from the Caribbean at a higher than normal price, and Britain argued that it was a form of compensation for British colonialism for 200 years in the Caribbean, and as a way of saying kind of sorry, we're gonna give you kind of monopolistic rights over selling your bananas to Great Britain. And of course, the United States, who were very much behind the other brand of bananas called Chiquita, they said, no, you cannot sort of accept only, a certain brand of bananas. You have to accept everybody's banana. This is a sort of a free market, etc. So if you're going to give high prices to, a Caribbean brand, you need to give a higher price to a Chiquita, etc., and you have to allow Chiquita to be able to compete. And most of the Chiquita bananas come from Central America, often run by huge corporate farms, run by American interests, and therefore the Americans definitely were not prepared to put up with any funny business by the British, who were going to give special treatment to one producer of bananas than the other. And the World Trade Organization had a court case on this, and they decided that, in fact, the Americans were right, that Britain does not have the right to give preferential treatment to anybody, that the world market is the world market, and that's it. So this is almost like a form of protectionism, the idea that you're kind of giving sort of preferential treatment to some people and some people you're not. And so we have to argue the case as to whether this is a good idea, or is free trade really what David Ricardo suggested about 300 years ago, where he said that not only does the free trade benefit everybody, but he even argued that it benefits everybody equally, which is the more difficult pill to swallow. And a lot of economists don't agree with that second point about let's say less developed countries benefiting from trade just as much as other countries. So what I want to do, first of all, is I want to somehow go through the handout that you all should have. I think I sent it to you, was it yesterday or the day before? And so for that reason, all of you should have this handout called Free Trade and Protectionism, where there's a little map on there about the free trade. And it basically tries to explain what are the main arguments between the two. I think probably we will be having a debate, a classroom debate on this topic, because I think it is a burning issue, and I think that it will help to illustrate exactly the issues that are burning on this topic. So the first thing you need to do is really look at the definitions. On the first page, it says that protectionism is the use of economic policies to regulate trade between countries, mainly to reduce imports, such as tariffs, quotas, and then medical and safety regulations. Okay, so tariffs is a very common expression. You've all heard it before. It's essentially a form of import taxes. It tends to be a very popular form of protectionism, partly because the government usually gains a lot of revenue from this type of tariff. So if you're going to have a tax, such as Donald Trump puts a tax on, let's say, Chinese tables, and then the American government is going to be receiving a huge amount of money from the Chinese, who have to pay this tax to the government in order to sell their tables in the United States. Okay, quotas. Probably the best example of a quota was George Bush Sr. This is about 30 years ago in the early 1990s, before Bill Clinton came around. And he basically, George Bush Sr. made a policy because he was worried about General Motors and all the American car companies in Detroit. And he decided to create a quota which basically said that United States could only import 1 million Toyotas from Japan every year. Well, that sounds like a clever idea, but of course, the problem there is that what you're effectively doing is you're creating a shortage. You're creating a shortage of cars because people will be fighting over the available Toyotas on the market. And for that reason, just the pressures of supply and demand will push up the price of Toyotas, and the Toyota company will benefit because they will be able to charge a lot more money for their cars, which are essentially in a shortage situation. So people are kind of frantically saying, oh, well, I'm prepared to pay even more, a premium price, to be able to buy this Toyota. So in some ways it didn't have the desired effect that the Americans were hoping, which is if there was a shortage of Toyotas, that there was only 1 million per year being brought into the United States, that people would therefore decide to go and buy American cars because they thought this would help the workers to hold on to their jobs and for American companies to maintain their profits, etc., etc. So this is something which is another possibility in terms of protectionism. The third one we mention is medical and safety regulations. Well, this has actually been brought up a number of times, where there was in Europe about 20 years ago something called the mad cow disease, where all these mad cows were running around, maybe bumping into each other and going crazy, and it was obviously a reflection of an illness. And the French decided that they were not going to buy any of these British cows that were going crazy, and that they decided to make a law that said no more British cows coming into France. So the question posed was, is this a genuine concern for the health of the French population, or was this just a form of protectionism aimed at helping the French farmer? And a lot of economists suspected it was the latter, that it was just a policy trying to help the rural population. Agriculture is a very big industry in France. It's actually the largest industry in the country. It's one of the few European countries that is much more rural than it is urban, and therefore voters tend to be in the rural community, and they're connected somehow to farmers, and therefore anything that the French can do, or the French government can do, to somehow help the French agricultural producer would probably be a vote getter. And so suddenly this law was brought in. The other one being a safety regulation, and I can also use an example of France, this time with Canada, where the French produce a car called deux chevaux, which means two horses. It really is a very inexpensive car. It's a car that is made by Renault, I think, and it's a very popular car all over the world. And one of the characteristics of the deux chevaux is that the body of the car is very, very low to the surface of the ground. And the Canadian government decided that this was really a dangerous situation, where a lot of Canada is under snow and ice for about 6 months of the year, and for that reason it means that if you're driving around with the body of the car being very low to the ground, you could easily be having an accident, hitting the snow and ice, etc., etc. So what did the Canadian government do? To make a long story short, that they decided to create a law that says, okay, we're not going to allow this model of car into Canada because it is a danger to the safety of Canadians driving the car in winter, and therefore we will ban this car. And the obvious question is brought up. Was this done genuinely for the safety of the citizens of Canada who were in danger by driving this car, or was it actually an example of protectionism? And we'll never know. A lot of Canadian economists are somewhat cynical, and they'll say, well, that the government was just trying to discourage imports into the country so that cars produced in Canada would actually gain preference by Canadian consumers. So these are the main characteristics of protectionism. Certainly free trade is something which is promoted by many people. Certainly conservatives, monetarists, supply side economists are always talking about the benefits of free trade, that they don't really want the role of government to be intervening in trade between countries or between areas. And so for that reason, you'll find that certainly since World War II, you would have the reality being that arguments in favor of free trade are on the way up, and arguments in favor of protectionism are on the way down. Now, this has partly been promoted by a lot of the economic unions such as the EU or the ASEAN countries or NAFTA between Canada, United States, and Mexico. And this argument that everybody benefits from free trade was a very powerful argument, certainly up until the mid 2015, 2016, until Donald Trump came around and sort of put everything on its head and said, no, 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 we're going to do it differently. But certainly up until about, so that was for about 60, 65 years that the free traders really had the main arguments in terms of international trade. And they used to use people like David Ricardo as an intellectual sort of defense of the arguments that really we should try to avoid any form of protectionism at all. And this was also promoted by the World Trade Organization, which is an organization based in Washington, by the way, where they go around the world essentially promoting free trade. And they argue the benefits of free trade, that it helps countries to specialize and it helps countries to be more dependent on imports for things that they are not very efficient in producing, etc., etc. And so a lot of people, certainly if you didn't have a strong opinion on it, were so overwhelmed, so overblown by all these arguments for free trade that most people said, well, I suppose that must be the case. I myself, personally, I'm not an extreme free trader, and it's perhaps one of the only examples where I have sympathy with Donald Trump was the idea that we need to bring in a certain amount of protectionism to make sure that workers' interests are not being sacrificed just to make more profit or to sell more products. And so this is a debate that will probably go on for another 100 years. It's not that easy to find a solution. If you had a totally free market where no restrictions whatsoever, you'd probably have a lot of problems. A lot of people would be really upset. They might start saying that, a lot of bad things are going to come into our country, things like, drugs or evil things that are going to come into our country, like guns and things that we don't want, or things even, which are culturally not acceptable to our country. So for example, you could have laws that said, well, McDonald's hamburgers are kind of against our culture, and this is a foreign food, and that we shouldn't really be having foreign food in our country. And that might be a negative thing. That might kind of promote a certain form of xenophobia, where people somehow feel that anything that's foreign is actually not a good idea. The reality of life, of course, is that most people, whether you're in Canada or in Vietnam or anywhere else, they tend to believe that it's a good idea, that most people, if you gave them the choice, would you like to have a Vietnamese-made telephone or a Japanese-made telephone? I reckon that everybody in class, and probably 99% of the population, would say, oh, yeah, we want a Japanese telephone, because the Japanese telephones in their minds are somehow better. And I've come across that myself in my dealings in Hanoi, where shopkeepers will be very proud to tell me that, oh, no, this product is not made in Vietnam, this is an imported product, as if that's somehow something to brag about or something that is good. So the reality of life is that although it was true in my generation, when I was young, most people would say you've got to buy Canadian, okay? You've got to always buy, things that are made in Canada, because that shows that you love your country and that you're protecting Canadian jobs. Well, I got to be honest with you today, the present generation probably couldn't care less, okay? They just want the product which is at the cheapest price and at the best quality. And where it's made, I don't think too many people are looking under the tablecloth to see, where is the product actually being made. They're not that interested. If it's a good product, that's what they want, okay? And this is globalization. This leads on to other subjects as well. The fact that we have imported everything these days, including importing teachers as well. And people are not that interested, as to, even what country I come from. They just want to know, do you know how to teach economics or do you not? Are you a good sort of Cambridge A-level teacher of economics or not? And it's the same thing, are you a good telephone or are you a lousy telephone? If you're buying a TV set, does anybody really care, where the TV set was made, as long as it was, it's got dazzling colors and it's not too expensive? That's the reality of life today. So the definition of free trade, therefore, is that international trade conducted without the existence of barriers to trade, such as tariffs or quotas. So really, that is the definition. Protectionism means that you've got the government intervening to create some form of barriers, and free trade means that there is no government intervention and there are no government barriers to trade. Okay, if you turn the page, it talks a little bit about some of the arguments, and I mentioned things like dumping, which I said to you is really difficult to prove these days. The Chinese will often jump up and down and say, well, we're just more efficient than you guys, and therefore rather than criticizing us, you need to just get your act together and be as efficient as us. Okay, and it says there, but since the end of World War II, protectionism has been in decline where free trade has increased. And they talk a little bit about the key indicators of free trade, the idea that specialization is supposed to be good, that countries will specialize. We all know the theories about absolute advantage and how absolute advantage promotes specialization, that we do what we do well, and we don't do what we don't do very well, and we allow other people to do it, and we import those products that we don't do well. Okay, and we talk a little bit about retaliation, the possibility that if you do use protectionist policies, you may actually end up having a diplomatic sort of problem, because if you suddenly decide that you're not going to be buying Chinese chairs and tables for Walmart, but maybe the Chinese are going to get kind of upset. I mean, a funny example would be when George Bush Jr., George W. Bush, he kind of argued that, he didn't approve of, Chinese selling products at a cheaper price. And he decided that, he was not going to go to the Beijing Olympic Games. He wasn't going to go to the opening of the Beijing Olympic Games. And he sort of thought this was going to be a real sort of proof that nobody pushes the Americans around, and that, the Chinese were accused of playing around with their own currency to be able to sell their products more easily. And George W. Bush said, well, okay, I'll teach them a lesson. I'm not going to go to the Olympic Games. And he made it a very public declaration. And then suddenly the Chinese said, oh, really? You're going to do that? Okay, no problem. Then you owe us more than a trillion, that is about 12 zeros, I think it is, in bonds, okay, in public debt, that if you're going to humiliate us at the Olympics, then we want you to pay that debt right away. Oh, George Bush was on that plane so quick, you wouldn't have been able to see him. He was moving so quickly, and he was sitting there with his little American flag, waving his American flag, saying, go American athletes, go. So this is a really good example as to the political dimensions of international trade, that a lot of countries like China are not going to be pushed around anymore. And, if you think that you're going to dictate to them, they have leverage. They have leverage, and that leverage may be that they're holding on to debt, or that they're not going to trade with you anymore, or all sorts of issues that could actually be very damaging. Now, what are the arguments? What are the main points? If you look on the bottom of page 2, you can see that we have a number of really good arguments for protectionism. And the number one is probably this infant industry theory that has been brought up, that you need to really make sure that young firms that have just started up are given a little extra help by the government and have a bit of protection. And that's what the word infant industry, almost like a child that needs to be protected from the real world, that this has actually been introduced so that small firms will be able to develop and become larger firms and to contribute to the country's GDP and pay taxes, etc., etc. So this was the first one, was the infant industry sort of theory. I gave you a couple of examples in the handout that I don't need to go on to now. One related to Quebec, Canada, and solar panels, and the other one related to Vietnam making motorcycles and telephones at the moment, and how both countries have actually introduced forms of protectionism because these are kind of new industries that need to be protected. Another argument, which is somehow connected to it, is the idea that by bringing in protectionism, you're going to save jobs. That by making the imported product just as expensive as the local product, that you will somehow be able to encourage local consumers, domestic consumers, consumers from your own country, to buy local rather than to buy imported products. And so we brought up an example about domestic steel, which tends to be much more expensive, and it would have been a lot cheaper if you actually had brought it in from other countries. So this is another argument that is brought up to promote protectionism. Some economists argue that countries that underprice their products to break into the new market usually are using cheap labor. And this is an argument I tend to sympathize with, to be honest. I'm actually very concerned that, we're let's say, importing, let's say apples. I mean, Canada is a huge apple producer, and let's say we decide that we're going to import apples from Jamaica. And why are we doing that? Well, Jamaican labor, the workers, are prepared to work at a much lower price. Their conditions of life, they probably don't have a minimum wage, that a lot of the precautions that Canadian producers have to maintain are not held in other countries. And for that reason, what we are effectively doing is we are encouraging bad behavior by other countries who will try to undercut, your prices by just paying workers a lot less. I mean, this is a very controversial issue because many people feel that this is a sign of better efficiency, the idea that we are more efficient because we're able to lower the labor costs to unbelievably low levels. So if you can find a country that is prepared to pay their workers $1 a day, then you're supposed to be very proud of yourself because you're now being super efficient. And that goes for, inputs into your product, maybe a car, that maybe you're getting the rubber for the tires at an unbelievably cheap price because, workers in the rubber producing countries are being paid $1 a day, and you're able to pass that savings on to the consumers, and therefore you're being super duper efficient. Well, congratulations, but what are you doing? You're almost promoting exploitation and the bad treatment of workers, and this is a controversial subject. Of course, the free marketeers, the free traders are going to say, well, this is actually comparative advantage. This is actually something which is a key sort of characteristic of, let's say, the economy in Jamaica, and if it wasn't for the cheap labor in Jamaica, that you would actually not be able to sell your apples. So it would be wrong to take away that kind of benefit of trade that Jamaica has, which is the cheap labor, which in some ways, in my opinion, is a very cheesy type of argument, but it's a very common argument and economists will use it all the time. It is argued that there would be a misallocation of resources if domestic consumers were forced to buy from high-wage domestic industries rather than low-wage foreign industries. Which, what are you really saying? You're really saying that, it's bad to buy products from countries that respect their workers and that pay their workers a living wage. Okay, so This is an argument that I don't follow, but I know that this is mainstream neoclassical economics, and we need to know the arguments on both sides. And then the final argument in favor of protectionism is this whole thing about national security. Are you trading in dangerous products, things like, I don't know, nuclear energy or whatever, that you need to have some form of government control over products that may be of a particular importance to your country. I know that there's a couple of examples, let's say, I think it's in China and in Russia, where you have certain minerals that make your telephone work, your mobile telephone, and they're called, I can't remember the actual minerals, but there's a couple of minerals that are in very short supply, and that they're found in a very small number of countries. And if, for example, these countries decided not to sell their products as a means perhaps of pushing the price up or for political leverage, then you could actually destabilize the economy so that Apple would not be able to sell their iPhones, etc., etc. And these would be, good examples of where countries will often intervene in free trade in order to gain a certain amount of political advantage. It may be things like weapons or nuclear energy, but unfortunately it's usually arguments about products that are in short supply in the world and that consumers in the West don't want to pay high prices. So the bottom line is that, what can you do? So finally, they talk about domestic producers, workers, governments, their living standards, trade unions. People who tend to promote equality are usually the traditional winners in protectionism. And you'll find that free trade tends to be an idea that is promoted by the business community, those that want to maximize production, maximize profits, and they believe that free trade benefits everybody and benefits everybody equally, etc., etc. And that is what the whole argument is all about. So what I would advise you to do is I would advise you to read carefully the handout that you have, and then to answer the 3 questions at the end. Okay, and this is your homework. This is your homework questions that you need to do, and you need to send them to me. I've noticed that you may be, putting it into your exercise book, but you need to actually send them to me. And I've been contacted by Chuvenan administrators who say that if the students have graphs or writing in exercise books, they need to take a photograph of those pages and send those pages to me so that we can assess whether you're doing your work or not. And from that, we can make an assessment as to whether this online learning is being effective or not. This is not a choice issue. You have to do the homework, and for that reason, there's no way to avoid it. Either send it to me by Google Docs or Google Classroom or email, but don't just sit there saying, well, it doesn't really matter. It does matter, and it's not okay for some of you not to do your homework. So there's 3 questions. In what way does a tariff distort international trade? That's a really good question. A lot of monetarists would definitely argue that tariffs are distorting the free flow of goods and services. What is a quota, and how might a government raise money from quotas? Okay, remember the example that I gave you about sort of George Bush Sr. and saying that there's going to be only 1 million Toyotas imported in the country. And then finally, we've got discuss the arguments for and against the reduction of tariff barriers with the objective of increasing food production in your country. Okay, so how would food production be affected either positively or negatively by tariff barriers? So write those down, okay? Write the answers down, send them to me, and I will assess them, and I'll be able to give you some sort of feedback. We're going to see you again in the next the next video, probably this weekend, maybe Sunday perhaps, and we'll speak to you again. So until next time, bye bye.